And here we're going to look at both, for all intents and purposes, human geography and physical geography. That is, the people and the land. Because we are talking both about a history of a group as well as the land which inhabits it. Now, at the very outset, we should address an issue that has characterized virtually all of Europe's peoples, whether they have their own state or have lost statehood, or maybe never even enjoyed independent statehood. Maybe I should scratch the verb enjoyed. Being an independent state is not necessarily a big deal. Sometimes it's smarter to be living in another state and leave the big problems to others. But generally it's considered in the history of nationalism to be an ultimate goal. But what is that issue that also I want to talk about here as the first one it's the issue of nomenclature. That is how a given people has been called by its own members, and also how it's been called by outsiders in the past, and how and when its present ethnonym or national name was adopted and accepted as the current norm. So the question of nomenclature. Now, throughout this course, we will use the ethnonym Carpatho-Rusyns. But we should note at the very outset that this is only one of many names that in the past has been used to describe the group. Group members have traditionally associated themselves with the name Ruth, pronounced, I guess, in English as that, Ruth. This word Rus is a concept that has been expressed in formulations as the people of Rus, Ruski Ljudi, the people of the Rus faith, Ruska Vera, or in the nominative forms, Rusnak or Rusyn. I should also add parenthetically at this point that the concept of Rus should not, as we shall see later in this course, should not be confused with the geographic term Russia and the ethnonym Russian. Rus is not Russia and Rusyn is not Russian. Crucial. Now, admittedly, this term Rus and its adjectival form, Rusyn, and then also used as a nominative, are rather vague. Why? Because since medieval times, Rus referred to the lands inhabited by all East Slavs. All East Slavs, that is modern-day Ukrainians, Belarusians, and even Russians. While this term Rusyn or Ruthenian in English was the official designation for Belarusians and Ukrainians until the outset of the 20th century. And so to be clear about the specific people that is the subject of this course, we should add a geographic preface resulting in the ethnonym Carpatho-Rusyns. That is, the Rus people whose traditional homeland is in the Carpathian Mountains. Now, traditionally, the vast, or the most widely accepted self-designation used by the people themselves was this ethnonym Rusnak. Not Rusyn, actually, Rusnak. And that form is, in fact, still being used by one group of Carpatho-Rusyns, those living in the diaspora in northern Serbia, in an area called the Vojvodina. Finally, there is one other regional term, actually of very recent origin, but that nevertheless has currency among Carpatho-Rusyns living north of the Carpathians in what is today Poland. And here I have in mind a regional term called Lemko. Lemko, or Lemko-Rusyn. Now, like their ethnonym, also territorial names for their territorial homeland, which we're calling Carpathian Rus, there were several names. And again, for the purposes of this course, we're going to use the term Carpathian Rus. This name has historic and cultural, not only political or not political connotations, historical and cultural. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, Carpathian Rus has never existed as a discrete administrative entity. It's never existed. Nor has it had independence, whether in all of its territory or even political autonomy, except for one small period. Rather, Carpathian Rus is like many lands in Europe. See if you even know where they are. Friesland, Wallonia, the Basque Land, Kashubia, Ladinia. All of these territories, Catalonia, I think some of you know where that is. All of these territories have functioned as historic homelands in the minds of their inhabitants, and in some cases are even perceived as such by the outsiders. Certainly everyone knows Catalonia. The defining feature of these historic homelands is that the majority of inhabitants who belong to a distinct people or an ethno-linguistic group, Frisians, Walloons, Basques, Kashubians, Catalans, or in our case, Carpatho-Rusyns. Since this is what we would call a nuts and bolts lecture, we're getting down the basic factage of who, where, and how are these people. Well, according to linguistic criteria and certain cultural markers, as is used by anthropologists, Carpatho-Rusyns belong to the Slavic branch of Indo-European peoples. The Slavic branch of Indo-European peoples. In a sense, then, they are Slavs. And in that case, alongside Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians, they are classified as East Slavs, because the Slavic peoples in general are divided into East Slavs, West Slavs, and South Slavs. And the East Slavs are Ukrainians, Belarusians, Russians, and Carpatho-Rusyns. Among the cultural features or markers that link Carpatho-Rusyns with other East Slavs is their traditional Eastern Rite Christian orientation, which we will speak about next time, whether that be Greek Catholicism or Orthodoxy. Now, since Carpathian Rus, the territory, never functioned as a distinct political administrative entity, how then does one determine the boundaries of this historic territory? If it didn't exist on a map, then where is it? In short, might sound very simplistic here, Carpathian Rus is where Carpatho-Rusyns have historically lived. And I stress here the adverb historically. Why? Because in the course of the second half of the 20th century, in particular, the extent of the Carpatho-Rusyn inhabited territory has been reduced, either because of physical displacement, people were picked up and removed, as we're going to see, or because of national assimilation, which is kind of natural, somewhat helped natural phenomenon. And so our understanding of what historically constitutes Carpathian Rus derives from a period before this physical displacement and before this national assimilation primarily occurring in the second half of the 20th century. In short, the boundaries of Carpathian Rus encompass those settlements in which at least 50%, very often more than 50%, actually live there, but settlements in which at least 50% of the inhabitants described themselves as Carpatho-Rusyns in the census reports of 1900, 1910, and 1921. And at that time, approximately 1,100 settlements, 1,100 settlements, mostly villages with an average between 300 and 1,000 inhabitants, could be classified as Carpatho-Rusyn. That is at the outset of the 20th century. And where are those villages? And what constitutes the historic territory of Carpathian Rus today? Well, if we begin with the political situation at the outset of the 21st century, Carpathian Rus straddles the borders of four countries. And those four countries, as you can see on this map, are Poland, Slovakia, Ukraine, and Romania. And it's this green portion which is the historic area where more than 50% of the population in those places was of Carpatho-Rusyn background. And so we have one Carpathian Rus, four different regions depending on the country where they are presently located. And those four different regions are the territory in Poland is known as the Lemko region. Carpathian Rus in northeastern Slovakia is known as the Prešov region. Carpathian Rus in present-day Ukraine is known as Subcarpathian Rus, or modern-day Transcarpathia. And the little chunk of Carpatho-Rusyn lands in north-central Romania is known as the Maramureș region. The Maramureș region. And it is in these four regions where until the mid-20th century, Carpatho-Rusyns lived on contiguous or geographically connected territory. Now, I kept using the term at least 50% of the population, often more, but I never said 100% of the population. Implication being that not all the inhabitants within Carpathian Rus were ever Carpatho-Rusyns. Other groups have included Slovaks and Magyars or Hungarians, Jews, Austro-Germans, Roma or traditionally known as gypsies, among others, who lived in varying proportions, both in villages and in small towns and cities. Now, you might ask, as many people do, so we're talking about the historical past. We are defining Carpathian Rus according to inhabitants that existed there at the beginning of the 20th century. What about today? Are there any Carpatho-Rusyns left today? In the future, those of you who are still going to be here, you may want to not sit in the back, sit in the front, because I'm always handing out things, because it makes it a little bit complex for those of your colleagues sitting up front who now are assigned the task or designated the task to get things into your hands. Well, as you can see from this chart that I've just handed out, there are officially about 111,000 Carpatho-Rusyns in various countries of the world, not only in Europe. But that's official data, statistical data, and official statistical data is always problematic for stateless peoples. And in one particular case, one of the countries where the vast majority of Carpatho-Rusyns live doesn't even recognize them and doesn't count them. So it makes it very difficult to know how many there are. So there could be almost as many as 1.8 million, but official calculations, as of the second decade of the 20th century, there are about 111,000. So that's for human geography. Let's look at physical geography. This territory, Carpathian Rus, as we see it here, extends about 375 kilometers from this area in eastern Slovakia and southeastern Poland, across the mountains into Ukraine, way over here to the upper reaches of a river in Romania. So that's 375 kilometers in this direction. The width can be as narrow as 50 kilometers or as wide as 75 or 100 kilometers in width. This area encompasses several mountain ranges of the Carpathian Mountains, and important, its lower foothills. Now, since the Carpathian mountain crests form a major European watershed, and if we look at a purely geographic area, this map of Central Europe, these are the Carpathians that swing around, starting here in western Slovakia, through Slovakia, southeastern Poland, Ukraine, and into Romania. And they used to, as you can see, they circle this flatland plain in the middle, called the Hungarian Plain or the Danubian Basin, from the river Danube. And the Carpathian Rus is this watershed, namely the crests of the mountains divide the water. Rivers north run north into the Baltic Sea, rivers south run south into the Tisa, the Danube, and eventually the Black Sea. So we have, as a serious watershed, this boundary, but there's one exception, and I'll mention the exception and you'll see why I mention it, and that is the farthest western river called the Poprad, which you're going to have to know from your maps, over here in Slovakia. It begins, quote unquote, on the southern slopes of the mountains and crosses the mountains to the northern slopes. So how can a river cross a watershed? This is impossible. However, the mountains are so low in this area, that's where the present-day boundary of Slovakia and Poland is so low that one of the rivers actually starts south of the mountains and crosses, quote unquote, to the north. That geographic phenomenon underscores the fact that the Carpathian Mountains are at their lowest in the western part of Carpathian Rus, that is here. If we look at the same area here, you can see the darker orange where they're heavy and hardly any dark orange at all here. And as a result of those very low mountain passes between what is today Slovakia and Poland, this has made communication easy and relations among Carpatho-Rusyns in the Lemko region of Poland and the Prešov region of Slovakia very easy and very close. Now, these mountains do get higher the farther east that one goes in the area of what is now Ukraine. And you can see it how on this physical map they get darker and darker. The heights are higher. And so if here the very highest peaks maybe 1,000 meters, farther east they reach 2,000 meters, that's more than 6,000 feet. And the few passes that are found that connect this part of Subcarpathian Rus with the rest of Ukraine, those passes themselves are 900 or 1,000 meters above sea level, which makes them quite difficult. And that in large part explains why contact between this area of Carpathian Rus, Subcarpathian Rus, and this part of Ukraine, which is known as Galicia, has always been much more difficult and resulting in greater isolation of this part of Carpathian Rus from lands and cultures to the north and east. Now, since much of Carpathian Rus is covered by mountain forests, beech, oak, fir, spruce, wood has been the region's most important natural resource. Other resources include salt, especially in the eastern part of Subcarpathian Rus, mineral water, various times together with lumber have been a source of income and wealth for the region. Now, it is true that the vast majority of Carpatho-Rusyns have in modern times, and up to modern times, been agriculturalists. But the mountainous terrain has allowed at best for subsistence farming, that is, crop production, which at best can support single families with little or no real surplus to sell. The limited agricultural resources of the inhabitants have traditionally been supplemented by products derived from transhumance or pasturing of cows, and in the highland mountains, sheep. Better suited to agriculture are the foothills and the plains down here, in particular in Subcarpathian Rus or Transcarpathia, which actually is really an extension of that Hungarian lowland plain. And it is an agriculturally fertile area that has traditionally been able both to sustain local farmers and to provide from those fields vegetable farms, vineyards, orchards, surplus for sale, and extra income. Now, whereas Carpatho-Rusyns have traditionally lived in rural villages, they have also been drawn to several towns and small cities just to the north. And as you can see on your map, and it's going to be part of your map test, there are a whole bunch of these cities in southeastern Poland, like Nowy Sącz, Gorlice, Sanok, etc. Same in the Prešov region and in Subcarpathian Rus, just bordering on where Carpatho-Rusyns live. these towns were like the vast majority of towns in Central and Eastern Europe. That is, they were almost always inhabited by other peoples, in this case, Poles, Slovaks, Magyars, Germans, Romanians, and most especially Jews. So it may be part of an area where the vast majority of the people is of one ethnic group, whether Czechs or Slovaks or Poles or Magyars, but the towns itself are like islands and comprised of various peoples, such as I've just mentioned. And until the 20th century, Carpatho-Rusyns did come to these urban centers, but primarily to trade or buy manufactured goods, and in a few instances to work at a limited number of jobs that were available, domestic servants, etc. But gradually, in the course of the 20th century, political and socioeconomic changes allowed for a greater number of Carpatho-Rusyns to leave their villages and leave them permanently and settle and work in these and other towns and cities nearby. Now, there are two last points, and I'll end on these, that should be made about the geographic context. The first is that in purely geographical terms, Carpathian Rus is located in the heart of Europe. Now, everybody or various countries in Europe like to claim that they're in the center of Europe. Right? Actually, there are at least 6 places in Europe who make that claim. But in fact, scholars already in the late 19th century, geographers and geodesic specialists, already in the late 19th century, specifically in 1887, pinpointed the geographic center of Europe. Of course, what is Europe? Well, we're taking the classic definition of Europe from the western coasts of Spain and Portugal to the Urals in the east, the Ural Mountains in the east, and from northern Norway to Crete in the south. And the geographic center of that area is literally just outside a small village in the upper Tisa River in Subcarpathian Rus, and this part, the farther eastern part of Subcarpathian. So this is literally the center of Europe. They put up a monument in 1887, and then 90 years later, when it was part of the Soviet Union, the Soviets came and put up another monument. So there are 2 monuments to this center of Europe. Okay, that's a nice little footnote piece of information. But despite its pan-European geographic centrality, Carpathian Rus has always been a peripheral part of whatever state ruled the area. It was always on the edges, dismissed. Being on the geographic periphery has inevitably had an impact, and often a negative one, on the political, socioeconomic, and cultural life of the region. In other words, the lands of Carpathian Rus have always been a kind of underdeveloped backwater within various states that in the past, and for that matter in the present, have ruled either all or part of this historic territory. The second and last point is that, considering its geographic location, Carpathian Rus has always been part of Central Europe, not Eastern Europe, of Central Europe. In other words, its political and cultural life, its trade patterns, have at least until the mid-20th century been exclusively drawn toward and determined by the lands of the Danubian basin. This is the area to which it has always been part geographically, culturally, etc. And as a result, the urban centers, which are their administrative capitals of the states, to where their intelligentsia went, those would have been Budapest in modern-day Hungary, Vienna in modern-day Austria, Prague in modern-day Czech Republic, to a lesser degree, Krakow in southeastern Poland, and to a lesser degree still, Lviv in far western Ukraine. It is that Central European reality that has determined the historical fate of Carpatho-Rusyns and their homeland Carpathian Rus. And it is to the history of that region that we will turn when we return next week. Thank you.